For the first episode of the NC Everything podcast of 2024, I decided to run down a few things that happened in January throughout North Carolina history. Welcome to the NC Everything podcast. I'm your host, Curtis, and this is the bi-weekly show where I talk about everything that has anything to do with North Carolina. Happy New Year's, everybody. I hope you had safe and fun holidays. I hope everybody's recovering from any activities they may have done that may have compromised their safety. Like I said in the intro, I'm going to go through things that happened in January throughout history in North Carolina. But before we get into that, I want to thank everybody for coming back for 2024. I hope this year will be better than the last. Not that last year was terrible. Could have been better, but I want every year to be better than the last. Since there's 31 things in January, I have 31 things here to talk about. Actually, it's 32. We'll get into that. But since this could be a longer episode, I want to say if you're watching on YouTube, you can see that I'm in the welding shop again. It's very cold outside. I actually thought about getting the burn barrel going and recording outside, but we have some company today, so I'm in the privacy of my welding shop. If you're watching on YouTube and you'd rather just listen, I can be found on most podcast players, but if you're listening on a podcast player and you'd rather put a face to the voice, I can be found on YouTube, and there will be a link for that in the description below. And as always, for more NC Everything, you can join the Facebook group. I don't have any questions you need to answer or anything like that. You can just join right up. And there I'll post North Carolina stuff, anything, if I'm bored, I'm scrolling through Facebook and I see something about North Carolina, I throw it on there and I invite you to do the same. I do a lot of listener suggestions. This episode obviously is not a listener suggestion. I'll get back into them real soon. I feel like I'm talking really fast here, probably because I'm freezing. It's like 41 degrees outside, and since this is a metal building, it's probably like 35 in here. But anyway, let's see. I've done the self-promotions. I'm going to try to do a whole lot less editing this year. I do a show with my wife, as some of you may know, Tasting NC, where we taste everything that has anything to do with North Carolina. And it's a completely raw show. Occasionally, I'll yell at my kids and I'll, cut that out. But for the most part, Tasting NC is a completely raw show. And I really want the NC Everything podcast to be that way too. I tend to lean on the perfectionist side of it. But anyway, that's one of my goals for this year. In addition to a few other things, maybe I'll tell you about as the year goes on. But I want to do a lot less editing this year. But anyway, let's go ahead and get into the content. The stuff in here, the 32 things that I'm going to talk about, they're in chronological order from January 1st to January 31st. However, they do jump through different years back and forth. So let's start with January 1st, 1865, Emancipation Day. And I don't have a script here. I have notes. You'll see me looking down a lot, but you can probably be able to tell I don't have a script here. January 1st, 1865, Emancipation Day. So Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was given, that sounded weird. Emancipation Proclamation was given on January 1st, 1863. And this declared that all slaves are free. But really, it took the rights of slave owners, it took their right away to have their slaves, their runaway slaves, returned to them. So when the slaves headed up north before this, southern slave owners, northerners are obligated to capture these escaped slaves, return them to their slave owners in the south. But now when former slaves made it up north, they were free. Now, when the Emancipation Proclamation went in effect, up north, there were celebrations everywhere. Now, as you can guess, that wasn't the case in the South. For former slaves, they would have been signing their death warrant if they had threw some sort of celebration for their freedom. But that all changed in New Bern in 1865. This would be the second anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. You see, at this time, New Bern, it was occupied by U.S. troops. So who's going to stop the U.S. Army from throwing an Emancipation Proclamation party? And like I said, the previous year, they had already threw an Emancipation Day celebration up north. And so down in New Bern, the U.S. Army put together their own Emancipation Proclamation Day celebration. I'm having a hard time repeatedly saying that. But anyway, they threw a parade in the streets of New Bern. The North Carolina Heavy Artillery Marching Band was playing music. And at the end of during the celebration, the actual Emancipation Proclamation was read. And the reason I'm adding this is the first Emancipation Proclamation Day. I keep saying Emancipation Proclamation Day. This was the first Emancipation Day celebration held in the South. And after this first one, it really took off. A lot of other places started having their Emancipation Day celebrations. And eventually, it wasn't white people talking about freed slaves. Prominent black leaders would eventually take over and hold their own Emancipation Day celebrations. All right, on to January 2nd. By the way, a lot of these, I'm not doing a real deep dive on any of it. I'm just kind of giving you a rundown. I'm probably going to go back to several of these later at some point in the show and do a deep dive on some of them. And a lot of them I've already covered on the show, so I'm going to say a lot less about the ones I've already covered. Like January 2nd, 1926, the Mount Olive Pickle Company was officially incorporated. I covered that in episode 10. And basically, there was an idea to repurpose a bunch of pickles that kind of went bad, but it recovered and turned into a pickle empire, Mount Olive Pickles. January 3rd, 1837, Nimrod Jarrett Smith was born. Now, Nimrod Jarrett Smith, he was a Native American with the Cherokee tribe. He was born near Murphy. And he was born right in the heart of the Cherokee Removal Act, which you know is the Trail of Tears. And if you're unfamiliar, during the 1830s, around 100,000 Native Americans from several different tribes were forced to leave their lands in the east and walk west until they got to the other side of the Mississippi River. And a lot of them went to Oklahoma, as you know, but the plan was, as long as you're on the west side of the Mississippi, we don't care about you anymore. And of course, that didn't last too long because, eventually we went over there and said, okay, now you got to get out of here. And I've talked about Native American extermination a few times. I'm not trying to make it political, but it is what it is. But Nimrod Smith, he decided he wasn't leaving. And a lot of people hid out in the mountains instead of leaving. That's why we still have Cherokees here in North Carolina, and there's Cherokees in Oklahoma. Nimrod was one of those, decided he wasn't going to leave. He would end up being raised in the Cherokee communities of Valleytown and Cheowa. I know I'm saying that wrong. Tracy, if you're hearing this, I'm really sorry. Valleytown, Cheowa, but he was also really close with the Oconaluftee Cherokees. He ended up joining the Civil War and fought with the 69th North Carolina Volunteer Infantry. He ended up reaching the rank of first sergeant. After the Civil War, he got into Native American politics, and his goal was working for better schools and better education for Native Americans. And one of the things he's remembered for doing the most is getting the state of North Carolina to officially recognize the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. And the reason I say that is, again, they told all of them to get the hell out of here, and a lot of them ended up out in Oklahoma. There was a percentage of them that stayed in North Carolina. So what happened, and again, I don't know a lot about Native American culture and history. I'm learning. So a lot of my Native American friends are probably, they can weigh in on this if they want to. But after the Trail of Tears, they said, okay, all the Cherokees are out in Oklahoma. And what about these guys over here in North Carolina? And North Carolina was like, well, they had their chance to leave. Now they're nobodies, and so they didn't recognize them as part of the Cherokee tribe. Well, Nimrod Smith, he was able to fix that, and so now you have the Eastern Band of the Cherokee. And before I move on, I just want to say on the name Nimrod, a lot of people might be chuckling or laughing. I work with a guy. His name is close to Nimrod. A lot of people think Nimrod means something idiotic or stupid, and that actually, whether you know it or not, it comes from a Bugs Bunny show where Bugs Bunny had called Elmer Fudd Nimrod. And so I think everybody started assuming Bugs Bunny called Elmer Fudd a Nimrod because he's an idiot. It's actually not. In history, Nimrod was actually the great-grandson of Noah, the guy who built the ark. And Nimrod was the guy who built the Tower of Babel. And if you don't know your biblical history, the Tower of Babel was supposedly they were trying to reach heaven, and God put a stop to it. But more importantly, Nimrod was a really great hunter. And so when Bugs Bunny called Elmer Fudd Nimrod, yeah, he was kind of picking on him, but it was because Elmer Fudd was a hunter, and so Nimrod, great hunter. It was more of a sarcasm. January 4th, 1856, the origin of the Maco Light. Now, I covered the Maco Light on the show. I can't remember where because I think it was a mixed show with other stuff in it. Might have been a Halloween special. But the Maco Light has been covered on the NC Everything podcast. But in short, a train accident occurred on January 4th, 1856, on the Wilmington and Manchester Railroad. One train stops on the tracks. Soon after, another train comes down the tracks and slams into the first train that had stopped. Then there was a guy sitting in the caboose, and when he heard the second train coming, he got out with his lantern and he was trying to, signal the second train to stop, but the signal didn't work. Now, this man with the signal light, he was killed violently in the train accident, and he was beheaded. And now on some nights, you can see strange lights on the tracks. Some say it's that guy from the caboose who lost his head, and he's out there trying to find it. Others say that he's out there with his lantern trying to warn other trains of incoming danger. Anyway, January 5th, Lillian Exum Clement took her seat in the North Carolina House of Representatives. She was the first woman in the South to hold a legislative office. She was born in Black Mountain in 1886. She worked in the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office while studying law at night. And in 1916, she passed the bar exam, and the next year she opened her own practice. She was nominated as a Democratic candidate 2 months before the 19th Amendment, which of course gave women the right to vote. She beat out 2 male opponents in the primary and won her seat. Ultimately, she would introduce 17 bills. After her time in the legislature, she became the director of the state hospital at Morganton. She would ultimately die of pneumonia and was buried in Asheville's Riverside Cemetery. January 6th, 1870, NC Central Prison opens. I don't have a whole lot to say about NC Central Prison, but I did find kind of a cool fact. During the construction, they used, of course, prisoners to build the prison. And, prisoners from local jails in the area. And they did most of the construction work, but the father of author Thomas Wolfe, W.O. Wolfe, was hired to do some of the stonemason work. Also, the first 3 prisoners at the NC Central Prison were 1 man and 2 women who had been convicted of robbery in Johnson County. January 7th, 1839, the first silver mine in the United States opens at Silver Hill near Lexington in Davidson County. The mine was called the Washington Mine. However, Washington Mining hit trouble with the refining process, and they closed in 1852. The mine was reopened as the Silver Hill Mine in 1854 by the company called Zinc and Silver Mining Company. And the Zinc and Silver Mining Company, they provided lead to the Confederate Army during the Civil War and shut down for good in 1882, again because of difficulties with the refining process. January 8th, 1926, TV icon Soupy Sales was born in Franklinton. He was born Milton Suppman in Franklinton, North Carolina. He started out on radio, but he would ultimately spend 40 years on radio and TV before passing away in 2009. January 9th, 1878, Tabitha Holten became the first woman licensed to practice law in North Carolina. She was born in 1854 near Jamestown. She had 3 brothers, all who were lawyers. She graduated from Greensboro Academy in 1878. I think Greensboro Academy came up in my Greensboro episode. And she set up her practice in Dobson, North Carolina. Unfortunately, she didn't practice law for very long because she died from tuberculosis in 1886, only 8 years after she got her license to practice law. January 10th, 1936, the first state highway marker was dedicated. And if you're riding around and you had to have seen these, black and gray, black and white historical markers on the side of the road, a lot of my show comes from those markers. The first one was dedicated in 1936, January 10th. It was placed in the town of Stovall in Granville County to commemorate the life of John Penn, who was an early political leader and signer of the Declaration of Independence. John Penn has been on my list a while to cover on the show. I hadn't got to it yet. But he was born near Port Royal, Virginia, which we'll forgive him for. But in 1774, he moved to Stovall, North Carolina. When he got there, he became a representative of the Carolina Colony's 3rd Provincial Congress in August of 1775. Then he was elected to the Continental Congress, and during his time there, he signed the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation. January 11th, 1861, Charlotte Hawkins Brown dies. Now, I covered her in episode 107 of the show, and I think that episode is on, the episode is on Sedalia. But down in Sedalia, she opened up a little school and left a really, really huge mark on the town that kind of died away, but they're bringing that history back now. And I think with the work they're doing down in Sedalia, I think Charlotte Hawkins Brown will always be remembered now. But like I said, that history kind of went to the wayside for a long time and was almost forgotten about. January 12th, 1896, 3 students at Davidson College experimented with X-rays. That sounds kind of vague. It's kind of a cool story. A German physicist named Wilhelm Roentgen, he discovered a new form of radiation. So he was experimenting with cathode rays, and yes, I'm reading this. I don't know any of this by heart. He was experimenting with cathode rays, and he discovered these mysterious X-rays. So he noticed these quote-unquote X-rays pass through some objects. So he sticks his hand in front of the X-rays, and when he looked at the photographs, he saw silhouettes of his bones. Immediately, a bunch of science labs around the world, they realized they had the equipment to do the same experiment, so they started kind of messing with it. Well, then you got Henry Louis Smith, who was a physics professor at Davidson College. And he's noted as the first professional in North Carolina to experiment with X-rays. A week after X-rays had been discovered, 3 of Henry Smith's students decided to go play with the X-ray equipment. They had no idea they would be the first students in history to ever mess with X-ray equipment. So the story is they bribe a janitor to get into the building and get into the physics lab. They start putting stuff on the photograph paper and taking pictures of it with the X-ray stuff. It said they used an eggshell with a button in it, a rubber-covered magnifying glass, a cadaverous finger, and I think it was several things they had pictures of. And they had fun that night taking pictures, looking at it. I'm not sure what they did with the pictures, but they kind of got tossed to the wayside. What's crazy is it was years later before anybody realized that these kids even broke in there and took these pictures. And when they found the pictures, a lot of people thought they were cool. Today, the pictures that these students took are at the Davidson College archives. January 13th, 1968. I've read this story several times. The Lumbee versus the KKK. So in 1954, there was a Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, calling for the desegregation of public schools. A lot of you know about that. Naturally, the Klan wasn't really happy about this. On the night of January 13th, 1958, the KKK decided to give African Americans a break and go after the Lumbee. Crosses were burned on the front lawns of 2 Lumbee Indian families in Robeson County. Then the KKK planned a rally to be held in Robeson County just a few days after this cross burning. The rally was scheduled for the night of January 18th, 1958, in a field near Maxton, North Carolina. They said that the gathering was to put Indians in their place and end all this race mixing. And it was thought that there was about 100 Klan members coming to this rally. The arc of the light bulb really didn't spread out very far from where they were going to be speaking from, so they couldn't really see very far out into the darkness. Because of that, one thing they couldn't see was that they were surrounded by Lumbee. I had read a few years ago, I've read this story a few times. I read a few years ago in one article that somewhere in the dark, one Lumbee literally yelled that if anyone started speaking, they were going to start shooting. Well, I guess the Klan ain't very good at listening, because after a few minutes, one of the Lumbee tried to shoot the light out. A fight breaks out. Finally, someone did shoot out the light with a shotgun, and now it was pitch black out there. The Lumbee descended upon the field, yelling and firing guns into the air, scattering the overmatched Klansmen. The Lumbee came down hard on the Klansmen, and to be honest, they beat their ass. Most of the Klan hit the woods and ran like hell, and it went down in history as the Battle of Hayes Pond. That was the last time the Klan ever held a public event in Robeson County. January 14th, 1834, William Polk, the last surviving field officer of the North Carolina Continental Line, died in Raleigh. So he was the last surviving soldier from from the Revolutionary War in North Carolina. January 15th, 1865, Fort Fisher falls. The fall of Fort Fisher, which came up in episode 18 on Brunswick Town, it was a major fort down on the coast. And once it fell, the rest of the forts kind of fell like dominoes. January 16th, 1944, Ronnie Millsap was born. I covered him in episode 83. And for some reason, when I look at my statistics of my shows, at least on my podcasts, not the YouTube, the YouTube's pretty popular, but on my podcast, it is by far my most listened podcast. I love Ronnie Millsap, and apparently a lot of other people do too. But if you don't know, Ronnie Millsap was born in Robbinsville, unless I just said that. I went to Robbinsville. It's a very small town. There is some sort of museum up there. It was when I went, and it was closed the day I was there. But check out episode 83, Ronnie Millsap. And for the next one, January 17th, 1874, Chang and Ang Bunker die. That's episode 40 of the show. Now, after they died, they were buried up in Mount Airy. I don't really have a real strong link to Chang and Ang Bunker. However, one of their daughters I actually went to church with. She was an elderly lady when I was a kid, but and she looked white, but you could see that she had some Asian. And she was, if I ain't mistaken, she was Ang Bunker's daughter. January 18th, 1942, the standard oil tanker Allan Jackson was torpedoed by a German submarine 70 miles off the coast of Cape Hatteras. And I hadn't heard of this, and yes, I did kind of laugh when I realized that the oil tanker was called the Allan Jackson. It was hit by two torpedoes from a U-66 about 60 miles northwest of Diamond Shoals. The second torpedo caused the Allan Jackson to break into two pieces, and the vessel sunk in about 10 minutes. Of the 35 men on board, only 13 survived. January 19th, 1955, Paul Howard Rose dies at age 73. Paul Howard Rose was the founder of the Rose's discount department stores. He opened his first official Rose in 1915 and eventually opened 250 stores in the Southeast. He was born on October 17th, 1881 in Jackson, North Carolina. I don't know why I paused between there. He lived in Henderson, North Carolina, and he died, like I said, January 19th, 1955 in Palm Beach, Florida, and he's buried at Elmwood Cemetery in Henderson. January 20th, 1840, North Carolina's first public school opened up in Rockingham County. It was the first free school in Rockingham County, and it went into operation on the 20th of January. The entire county had been surveyed into 8 districts that were 8 miles long and 4.5 miles wide. 2 schoolhouses were to be created in each district. Then pretty soon, all these schoolhouses were built, and these were the first free public schools. January 21st, 1891, Governor Daniel Fowle declared war on the oyster poachers. The oyster pirates, which is what they started calling them, they're from northern waters, and they were raking oyster beds into Chesapeake Bay, but eventually they pretty much depleted all the oyster beds up north, so they headed down to North Carolina. And they were all too ready to deplete North Carolina waters of oysters. Governor Fowle passed legislation that said only residents of North Carolina could dredge for oysters. And then he started sending armed patrol boats into the Pamlico Sound to seize any illegal oyster dredging operations. Within 3 months, the Oyster War was over, and at least one captain and crew of a ship were taken to trial for it. January 22nd, 1828. Edward Warren, Surgeon General of North Carolina and Senior Medical Officer to the Egyptian Khedive, was born in Tyrrell County. I really don't have a whole lot to say there. I looked it up. There's not a whole lot notable. Maybe I'll take a deeper dive later and see if I can't put together an episode on Edward Warren, Surgeon General of North Carolina. January 23rd, 1950. After a 14-year break, the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse light was lit up again over the Atlantic Ocean. And now I covered North Carolina lighthouses in episode 49 of the show. And I don't know if this came up in that episode, but the 208-foot Cape Hatteras Lighthouse had been abandoned because seawater was getting too close. After they abandoned the lighthouse, they built a steel structure and put a light up there for a while. And this steel structure they called Skeleton Tower. But on January 23rd, I don't know if they decided that it wasn't that big a deal, but they lit Hatteras back up. Now, the lighthouse itself was moved in 1999, a total of 2,900 feet. And I talk about that in my episode. I think I covered it on when I talked about Hatteras Island, too. I didn't write down which episode that was, but I actually went down there during that time and saw, we were down on the coast when I was a kid, and we got to watch some of the operations of moving the Hatteras Lighthouse. And as a kid, it was pretty cool. January 24th, 1961, the plane crash in Goldsboro. I covered this in episode 91, and it is a really unbelievable story. It's one of my favorite episodes I've covered. This plane was carrying 2 atomic weapons, and it crashed. And that's all I'm really going to say about it. I want you to go listen to the episode. But I think it's called Broken Arrow, North Carolina. And a lot of people remark at how close we came to having a nuclear incident in our state. January 25th, 1990. Ava Gardner, who was born in Johnston County, died in her London apartment. I covered that in episode 61. January 26th, 1918, mini golf is born here in North Carolina. James Barber and his wife had a garden tea party and held a miniature golf tournament, and the sport took off from there. I covered that in episode 10 on Pinehurst. January 27th, 1993, world-famous wrestler Andre the Giant would die in France. And I covered Andre the Giant in episode 95. He had a home in Ellerby, North Carolina at the time of his death, and there's a museum down there in Ellerby, which I've been to. It's really cool. It's a small town, but if you like Andre the Giant, if you like Princess Bride or you like wrestling, it's worth it. You go to the museum and I actually sat down in Andre the Giant's recliner that he had in his house. It's kind of a cool experience. January 28th, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded 73 seconds after launch at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. All 7 members of the crew died in the disaster, including U.S. Navy Captain Michael John Smith, who was born in Beaufort, North Carolina. There's a really good documentary on it, a really sad documentary, where one of the engineers or something, they think the O-rings were the reason that it exploded. And what's really sad in the documentary, one of these engineers, I can't remember his name now, he told his wife the day before launch, he said that space shuttle is going to explode tomorrow. Like, he knew it. And one of those situations where nobody would listen to him. January 29th, 1920, President Woodrow Wilson issues a proclamation establishing the Nantahala National Forest. There's 154 national forests in our country. 5 are in North Carolina. Today, the Nantahala National Forest is 531,148 acres. January 30th, 1956, professional ice hockey comes to North Carolina. In January of 1956, a fire breaks out and destroys the arena that housed the Baltimore Clippers. They had 5 more home games left to their season. Well, the bigwigs in Charlotte, they get on the horn and they convince the team to come play their 5 remaining home games down in the Charlotte Coliseum. The Clippers agree to this, and they play their first game on January 30th, 1956 against the New Haven Blades. But something incredible happened that day. 10,363 people showed up to check out this hockey thing. The arena only had 9,500 seats. 3,000 people were turned away at the gates. The Clippers beat out the New Haven Blades 6-2. With a turnout like this, the Clippers went home and packed their bags. They permanently relocated to Charlotte the next season and changed their name to the Charlotte Checkers. And so, hockey in the southern U.S. was born. January 31st, a ship called the Metropolis was stuck on the shoals about 100 yards off the beach at Currituck. This ship was originally called the Stars and Stripes, and it was built in 1861. It was changed to a Navy warship in September of 1862, and it was used in the Battle of Roanoke later that year. After the war, the ship was refitted for passenger and freight transportation. During the winter of 1878, a company out of Philadelphia, either one, they chartered the Metropolis. Well, the name was changed from Stars and Stripes to Metropolis, by the way. They chartered the Metropolis to haul workmen and supplies to Brazil so they could build a railroad. The problem was the ship wasn't in very good shape at this time. They say by the time the ship got to the Chesapeake Bay, the cargo was shifting all over the place, and it was actually causing the seams to leak. On January 31st at 6:45 a.m., the ship hit the shoals. The alarm went out, and men from 2 life-saving stations nearby jumped to action. However, there wasn't a whole lot they could do. There were 245 passengers on board, and 85 died in the wreck. And that's 31 events. However, ironically, on that same day in 1921, the abandoned Carroll A. Deering was found. I covered this in episode 2 of the show. I've never went back and listened to episode 2, but you should. It was a really good story. There's a lot of strange circumstances surrounding the last time the Carroll A. Deering was spotted and actually sailing. Then the ship was found stuck and abandoned. No sign of the crew then or ever again. To me, it's a bigger mystery than the lost Roanoke colony. So there's 32 events for 31 days in January. And I spent the last couple weeks trying to figure out what I'm going to do for my first show back. And I don't know, I'm pretty happy with that. I thought I'd cover a lot of January events. And there's probably a lot more stuff that probably happened in January throughout our state. But these were the events I settled on. I hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to like, rate, and review. And even though this wasn't a listener suggestion, if you have a suggestion for an episode, you can go to the NC Everything Podcast at gmail.com and send me your ideas or just tell me what you think about the show. Don't forget to check out Tasting NC, that show I do with my wife where we taste everything that has anything to do with North Carolina. And I'll have a link to the Facebook group, the YouTube channel, Tasting NC. All that's going to be in the description below. Unless you're watching on YouTube, and of course I won't have a YouTube link there. But anyway, again, Happy New Year's. I hope this is going to be a great year for everybody. I'd like for it to be a pretty damn good year for me. I don't know if I'm going to make any changes to the show yet. I've thought about getting rid of that 30-second intro at the beginning, but maybe I'll just play 2 seconds of it and fade out. I don't know. But I got some resolutions coming. A lot of you may not know I'm a smoker. I would really like to quit smoking. I'm going to make a go of it next couple weeks. I'm going to try to quit cold turkey, but not today. But I am going to try to quit smoking. I'd like to make some improvements to the show wherever I can. And I got some other stuff I'd like to really, work on with myself this year. We'll see how it goes. But I'm not going to sit here and ramble on. Thank you all for joining and listening to my 32 days of January. And I'll talk to you in a couple weeks.